big picture that you can point to in 2 or 3 instances to say, look how our understanding really was benefited from these discoveries?
Well, we can say that history is important because without understanding history, we don't understand where we come from.
Sure.
And without understanding where we come from, we often don't understand where we're going. And so archaeology really contributes to that larger, bigger question of history. Before archaeology, we had history in terms of writing, and we had sources, Greek sources, classical sources. But archaeology really has helped us uncover tens of thousands of tablets in languages that have been deciphered, like Eblite, Akkadian, Egyptian, various languages. And that's just opened up a huge worlds of understanding in these different cultures to help us understand the interaction of these various civilizations as they've developed over time, and to also see that, we often think we're doing things for the first time, or that we've invented things for the first time. And it's true that they didn't have smartphones probably back then. But there's nothing new really under the sun. I think Solomon said that, right?
Sure.
There's nothing new under the sun. And so when you go back in history and you see the incredible, innovative accomplishments that were done back then, whether it's architecture, whether it's language, whether it's the sciences, mathematics, astronomy, it's actually very, very remarkable. And I look back at something like the pyramids. They're the oldest structures in the world, really. I mean, they go back to the very beginning of Egyptian history. Would we have anything today that still is standing, 4,000 years later? Just to see the monumental kinds of work that went into those kinds of things, and for what? To really promote an ideology, to promote an idea of eternal life, and to ensure that eternal life would take place for the ancient king that died. Those are meaningful things that still resonate with us today. And we can see that a lot of those ideas in the ancient world haven't changed today. They're still with us.
Fascinating too, isn't it? You mentioned the pyramids. I'm thinking of Stonehenge. So the pyramids have been standing there in full view just much longer than any of us have been. Same is true for Stonehenge. That's another ancient cluster of monuments. But in spite of that, and in spite of archaeology and history and so forth, there's still a great lack of understanding about some of this. I mean, there are discussions still today. How were the pyramids built? How in the world did they erect those stones at Stonehenge? Where did the stone come from? What was the purpose? It's interesting, isn't it, that there's still a lot of unanswered questions about some of these things that are hidden in plain view.
There are lots of unanswered questions. And so, archaeology really, we can provide some answers, but we have a lot of unanswered questions as well. One of my early professors said an archaeologist needs at least 2 things: a great attention to detail and a vivid imagination in order to put those things together and try to come up with ideas of what things were like actually in the ancient world.
How difficult is it? You deal with the ancient world all the time. How difficult is it to look at something you uncover in the sand or the dirt and accurately understand what this was, where it fit in, where it plugged in? I'm certain some things just like that. But I wonder, too, if archaeologists have looked at things over the years and said this was A, and years later, a revision of that very same study said, it was B, actually. Maybe later it was seen to be A, B, or even C. So I think I'm asking, not stating my thought, archaeology must be one of these sort of ever understanding or ever developing fields of science. Is that true?
Of course, yeah. We're building on a building block of knowledge, and so every site that gets excavated can change the perspective of what's going on many times. We also deal often with hypotheses and theories that are based on what we have found at a number of sites and putting those together, and it can take the one ugly fact that destroys the most elegant theory. So things can change very rapidly. An example of this is, the whole debate over King David.
Sure.
And the history of David. We had.
Now, you've been very involved in this.
And I've been very involved in this over the years. So there were a number of scholars in Israel that were arguing that David his kingdom was very, very small, not very large. It was based on the absence of evidence. We didn't have a lot of evidence for a lot of sites outside of Jerusalem dating to that time period. And then in 2007, one of those cities was uncovered by our team and excavated over a course of several years through 2013. And we suddenly have a fortified site with gates, with massive fortifications, with storage rooms, with all the attributes of what one would consider a city during that time period. So when cities were not supposed to exist, suddenly we have one. And that revolutionized the discussion and revolutionized the whole debate over the early history of Judah. And today, that was 2013, now almost 10 years later, we have a number of those same type of sites in the same region, and that have been excavated by other teams and other archaeologists. So that data is expanding as we go along. So in archaeology, it's always good to base your arguments on data, not the lack of data, because those things are always being rediscovered and being found.
Fascinating from a biblical point of view.
Right.
You pass me a Bible, I say King David existed, but your archaeological colleague might be inclined to say, slow down there a little bit, because we have a great lack of evidence for David's existence. Well, for me, I have the Bible. But for a scientist, I understand that scientist may say, that's just not enough for me. I get that. So how monumental was the discovery of the evidence of David's existence and what now apparently archaeologically was a great kingdom? For me, that sounds like it just had to be about the biggest thing ever. What was that like in biblical archaeology?
Well, in 1993, a team was excavating at the site of Tel Dan, and accidentally, they were working on a wall of a small structure outside the city gate. And in that wall was reused a stone. And as that stone accidentally turned over, they saw an inscription on it. That inscription actually was an inscription that mentioned David for the first time in history.
First time in history
outside of the Bible. Up to that point in time, just in the year prior to that, some biblical Old Testament scholars had argued that David didn't exist because we never found him in the archaeological record. Now, 1 year later, in 1993, that discovery was made, and that made headlines all over the world. That was a huge, huge thing. The House of David, referring to the kingdom of Judah. And it referred to him about 140 years after his time, which means he was remembered for quite some time. Now we know that David is mentioned at least 3 different times in other monuments like the Moabite stone or the Mesha stela, and possibly also at the Karnak temple on the Karnak reliefs of Shoshank I. So we have a number of different occurrences now. So at that point, the argument shifted. We now know David existed, but what the Bible says about David and his kingdom being that huge, is that really accurate? And so that's where the archaeological evidence for these various cities came in later on.
So it took thousands of years to uncover archaeological evidence for David. Someone might be thinking, well, what's so hard? Why couldn't you find something about David? Or why can't you just go and find? But what's the answer to that? It's all, well, the statement might be made, it's all hidden under the ground there somewhere.
Right.
Why, sorry for the question, why is it so hard to find some of this stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer to that is that only a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what can be discovered has been discovered. Number one, you have to understand that there are hundreds of sites in the Middle East, many of which are unknown. Every time a road goes in or a large building gets built in Israel, something gets uncovered, something is discovered.
I want to ask you about that. I hate to hit the pause button, but I will.
Yeah.
As an archaeologist, when you see a road being built or excavation taking place, they're going to build a skyscraper or an apartment building in Tel Aviv. Is there a little part of you inside that just dies? Because Or are they so careful over there that they'll go sifting through the rubble looking for stuff?
They will stop any construction if there's archaeological remains. So we have a road going over Bet Shemesh, for example, right now. Bet Shemesh was the ancient site that the Ark of the Covenant came to after it was captured by the Philistines, and then it arrived to Bet Shemesh. It's right on the border between Philistia and Judah. It's a thriving city today. Ace Hardware is there. That's where we buy some of our tools.
Here we go.
So at Bet Shemesh, they're expanding the road. It goes right over the ancient site. So they had salvage excavations now for several years, and they've discovered a huge part of the city. Bet Shemesh has been excavated for over a couple of decades now, but they have discovered a whole nother section of the city of the 7th century that we didn't even know existed. In fact, archaeologists have been saying that Bet Shemesh was not occupied in the 7th century. This is the time period, of course, of the Babylonian conquest by Nebuchadnezzar and other figures before that time. So fascinating stuff that comes from some of these salvage excavations.
Okay, I interrupted you a moment ago. We will uninterrupt in just a moment. I'm loving it, and I'm sure you are as well. With Dr. Michael Hazel, I am John Bradshaw. This is our conversation. Back with more in just a moment.
What does the Bible say about astrology?
Why do bad things happen to good people?
What color is Jesus?
If you have a question, we'd love to find an answer for you from the Bible. Line Upon Line from It Is Written TV.
Welcome back to Conversations, brought to you by It Is Written. My guest is archaeologist Dr. Michael Hazel. I asked you a moment ago about why we don't find more stuff, and interrupted you. I want to take you back. You talked about the fraction of the fraction of the fraction of the fraction. So archaeologists are really looking for very small needles in very, very large haystacks. But let me let you proceed with that. Why are we not just stumbling over nameplates with David's name on them every day?
So this is what I tell my students. You begin with, all of these sites all over the Middle East, only a fraction of which are known. Sometimes we find it, like construction-wise or so forth. Sometimes a farmer stumbles across something as he's plowing his field, and suddenly there's a site there. Many of these areas are restricted. Many of these countries have restrictions.
Sure.
In the Middle East, obviously, it's a very sensitive place, so a lot of areas aren't explored. Then those places that have been excavated are only excavated to a very small extent. So even when we I think of Ashkelon, the Ashkelon excavations. Harvard University dug there from the 1980s to this century, and probably spent 30 seasons there at the site. Less than 5% of the site is excavated.
Oh, no kidding. 30 seasons?
And a huge amount of funding that went into that as well. Great dig. Great. I worked with them one of those seasons. It was a wonderful experience, but great discoveries. We found a part of an arched gateway from the Middle Bronze Age. That's the time of Joseph, around the time of Joseph, the time of the patriarchs. We thought the Romans invented the arch, and we now know that the arch goes all the way back to that period, hundreds and hundreds of years before the Romans. So that's where neat discoveries are made.
Yeah.
But so you have a fraction of the site that actually is excavated. Then of that, you have only a fraction of those sites that are actually published, because archaeologists love to go from site to site to site to excavate, but the years that it takes to publish all the material, the millions of bits of data from that material, is very time-consuming. And then, once you get down to that, only a fraction of that which is published actually has a direct impact on an identifying mark of the Bible of some sort. So like the David inscription or something like that. And it can take years to get there. So, for instance, at Ekron, the Philistine site, I worked there for many years in the 1990s. It's one of the 5 Philistine cities. And Ekron, we didn't even know was Ekron. We guessed it was Ekron, but it wasn't until we got into the whole project, and it wasn't until the very last season that we found a large inscription that identified Achish, the son of Padi, the son of Yasad, the son of Yair, ruler over Ekron, and for the first time we knew that that was the site. So those kinds of things, inscriptions are very difficult to find. When we find them, we're very, very excited. When we find seals, when we find seal impressions, when we find those kinds of things that actually tie us back to the Bible and people in the Bible, that's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. So that's why sometimes we need to be cautious to say, well, so-and-so hasn't been found yet. Yet is the question.
Yeah. I want to ask you about some of these cool things that have been found, seals and so on. But first, I want to ask you to describe for me a day in the life, a typical day in the life of an archaeologist digging in a field. Dr. Michael Hasel, archaeologist, working a site, Lahish or someplace, Tel Dan. What's an average day like? Because I think it's easy to think of archaeology as, oh, look what I found. But I expect those experiences are kind of few and far between. What's an average day like?
So on our excavations that I conducted over the last decade or so, we had some of the largest projects in Israel, and we had about 120 people in the field. So that's, first of all, you have...
Is that a lot?
That's a lot.
Yep.
You have volunteers. You have square supervisors that are overseeing them. There are all archaeologists or archaeology students that have experience. You have various experts that are either at the site or that you have on retainer, so to speak, just in case you need them, in case something is found that needs to be analyzed or needs to be discovered and needs to be looked at. It's a multidisciplinary field that requires all of these different experts to weigh in because you're reconstructing everything in the past. So you need to have geologists to deal with the geology of the site. You need to have architects to look at the architecture, and you need to have artists to do all the drawings of the artifacts, photographers and drone pilots that can take aerial photography. I mean, we have a whole survey team that deals with the surveying and the mapping of the site. So there's all of this that goes on. But typically we wake up very early in the morning. We want to avoid the heat of the day. We work usually in the summertime because that's when university students are off and can work. And when we can work as well and are not teaching classes. So we're out usually by 5 o'clock a.m. We're in the field. We usually have a brief time of orientation of what the goals are for that day for the team. We break up into different fields because we're working in different areas of the site. And then we start excavating and start working very carefully. Now, sometimes we may be in a huge fill of dirt that needs to be moved through rather quickly, and so we use large tools like picks, and we call them tarias. They're kind of large hoes. And that can move quickly. When we get down to a floor, that becomes very meticulous. That's when you think of the typical archaeology stuff like dental tools and small trowels and small tools. That's when those things come out, and brushes and things like that, because that's where all the goodies are on the floors of these buildings. Everything needs to be photographed before anything is removed. On these floors, for example, they sometimes need to be drawn in place. We just had, for instance, this last week, I got an email from Israel that something that we uncovered in 2016, right at the beginning of the season, on the first day, in fact, it was an ivory comb, for your hair. All the teeth were broken off. We uncovered it at that time, but now in post-processing, we found out that comb has a 3-line inscription on it. And it's being read right now by one of our experts at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. That inscription, who knows what it says? I mean, to find an inscription on an ivory comb, that must be something that an elite person had.
Sure.
That was a very rare piece. We know exactly where that comb was found because we have notes. We have careful indications of where that comb was found, and we can reconstruct, okay, now we found this important inscription on it. What is the original context of that comb? What period does it come from? Was it found on a floor? Was it found, in our case, unfortunately, we think it was found in a pit, which meant it came from maybe placed there from a later period. But all of these things need to be carefully documented because you need to know the exact find spot in order to reconstruct what period it belongs to. And this all takes time. So we have a break at 7. We call it first breakfast. We have a break at 9. We call it second breakfast. That's a half an hour. We have a break at 11. That's called a watermelon break, where we have a little bit of watermelon.
That's a good break.
That's a good break, yeah. If you like watermelon.
That's popular.
And we often have fresh grapes. At Lachish, we're surrounded by vineyards, and we have wonderful grapes during certain seasons. And then by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we're done digging for the day. It's been an 8-hour day, pretty much.
Already.
And so we go home. We have lunch at the camp. We have a siesta where people sleep because they got up at 4:30.
Yeah.
And then in the afternoon, we get up and we wash the pottery that we found that day. We wash it, we scrub it down. The volunteers do that while the staff are inside the lab going through the pottery from the previous day, and we're reading the pottery and dating the pottery from all of these different contexts. Thousands and thousands of pieces, broken pieces of pottery. Pottery sherds are processed in that, and as well as the objects that are found, like that ivory comb. And then we go into that evening. Once that is done, we have a lecture for the field school. The students are getting credit for this. Then we have dinner fairly late. I don't like having dinner that late, but we usually have dinner around 8 o'clock or so sometimes. And then pretty much after that, there's some last things that need to be done, but it's bedtime because you're getting up the next morning at 4:30 again.
Someone is hoping I will ask you why the inscription on the comb wasn't noticed right away.
Good question. Because it was dirty, and it wasn't cleaned, and it wasn't. Some of these inscriptions are so faint.
Yeah,
they're scratched into. This was scratched into. Incised into the ivory, that it really wasn't noticed until now. And sometimes this happens. Sometimes we see it right out in the field and we're like, wow, this is awesome. And then sometimes it happens in post-processing, many times.
I said I wanted to ask you about some of the cool stuff that may or may not have been found. So what are some of the neat things, whether you've been involved in the archaeological process or not? We've spoken at other times about seals that have been found in the city of David, which is very dramatic.
Yes.
So what for you are some of the real exciting things that have been found that shine a light particularly on the Bible?
There have been so many, and some of those discoveries, like we just said, are made in the field. Some of those discoveries are made way after, when people are working in museums on tablets, translating tablets that have been found in the 1800s but haven't been read, let alone published.
Oh, well.
There was a situation in 2007 where a scholar from the University of Vienna was working in the British Museum, looking at names, and looked at a tablet and saw a name, Nebusarsachim. And he's like, Nebusarsachim. It was a tablet dating the 10th year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. It was a Babylonian tablet found in Babylon. And he remembered the name Nebusarsachim from a text in Jeremiah. Goes to Jeremiah, I believe it's Jeremiah chapter 39, sees a whole list of officials that Nebuchadnezzar left behind in Jerusalem to kind of oversee things as he took the captives back to Babylon. And one of those is Nebusarsachim, only he's also given a title in Jeremiah, and that same title is given to the same Nebusarsachim on the tablet.
Oh.
And so Professor Michael Yursa says, I believe that's the same person. That was an exciting discovery.
That's
that made
cool.
Headlines in 2007.
Oh, yeah.
Now that discovery was made 100 years, more than 100 years after it was discovered in the 1800s in Babylon. Other discoveries are made right out in the field. We were at the site of Lachish, and we had a small, tiny little dipper juglet. And in that dipper juglet, we found tiny little seals about the size of my thumbnail, maybe even smaller. And those seal impressions, pressed on mud or on clay in ancient times and placed on a letter. One of those seals, we had two inside the container, and then we sifted around the container because it was turned a little to its side, and we found two more in wet sifting and dry sifting. But two of those seals bore the name of Eliakim. And we went back and did the research. We could read it right out in the field. I mean, we could read it. We put it there, we took photographs, and, it was very exciting. But in the post-processing and post-research that was done in the publication that finally came out, We believe that this is the same Eliakim. It dates to the right time period as the Eliakim mentioned in Isaiah chapter 37, the head of the household of King Hezekiah. In other words, this was the guy in charge of the whole palace in Jerusalem.
Wow.
And now we found his personal seal. So then in 2009, again going back in time, a seal was found. 2 seals were found in Jerusalem. We've talked maybe a little bit about this before in another program, but 2 seals were found. And on those seals found in the city of David, actually in the Ophel, a little bit further to the north, more along towards the Temple Mount area, they're 10 feet apart from each other, the seal impression of King Hezekiah. And right next to it, the seal impression, less than 10 feet away, less than 3 meters away, just over 3 meters away, was the seal impression of an Isaiah the Navi, or I shouldn't say Isaiah Navi. Navi is the Hebrew word for prophet. Now there's a letter missing which causes a little bit of a question mark. The aleph is missing at the end, but this could in fact, the excavator Eilat Mazar suggested that it could in fact be the prophet Isaiah. And if that's the case, we have here a clear connection between these 2 contemporaries. And if you go back to Isaiah 37, all 3 of the people that are mentioned, there's 4 people mentioned, 3 of them now have been found on seal impressions. Another one, Shebna the scribe, is also been found in one of the inscriptions in Jerusalem. So we have all 4 of those. That makes it very exciting when you can reconnect with an ancient person that lived. It's almost when you find one of these seal impressions like this was the personal signature of an individual. So it's like reaching back and shaking somebody's hand almost. Wow. Very exciting.
Doesn't that have to grow your faith in the Bible as a living, valid historical document? It just does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'm writing a book right now where we have documented, over the course of 200 years of archaeological research, we've documented over 100 people of the Bible. Some of these are very famous people that one would expect, like King Sennacherib or Nebuchadnezzar or Hezekiah. Others are obscure people like Nebuchadnezzar, an official that's just mentioned in passing in one verse of the Bible.
But isn't that just as interesting, really, that you can validate an obscure figure from the Bible?
Absolutely.
That's got to be very strengthening for a person's faith as well.
It is. Because, what's the likelihood? It's like you said, the needle in the proverbial haystack. Yeah. What's the likelihood of finding that many people? And we have, in the book of Jeremiah, for example, in the city of David excavations, we have several of these seal impressions that have been uncovered. And those seal impressions are listed, these officials that Jeremiah actually goes in. When he goes in and reads the scroll to the king, those officials that are standing there with the king, the nobles, we've found their seal impressions that are mentioned in Jeremiah, and they were there in the palace.
So why do you think those seal impressions were found? I'll tell you my idea and tell me what you think. It seems to me finding a seal impression is a bazillion to 1. A very small. Why they would stand the test of why they would still exist, I don't know. Doesn't it seem to you, you must have had this experience again and again, doesn't it seem to you that this is God saying, I want you to find this. I want you to be able to say to the world, look, Isaiah, Hezekiah, I want these things to be seen. Don't you ever feel like in archaeology, God is on the sidelines or out there in the field with you, cheering you on, hoping or maybe orchestrating that certain things will be uncovered at certain times?
I think there's an element of that. I don't always think that it's chance. Many times it is. My colleague, who I've worked with for many years, says it's not chance. We're very strategic in where we go to excavate, where we are likely to find the best things. We are very strategic once we get to a site, where to go, where we think the best kind of discoveries are to be made. And yet there's still that risk involved that you could excavate for a whole season or 2 seasons and really not find anything significant. Right. But yes, I think there definitely is. And, when Isaiah's seal was uncovered, my friend in Florida texted me that day and said, have you seen the article? And I immediately renewed my subscription to the journal and saw the article right there on the spot. And it sent goosebumps because this is the largest Old Testament prophetic book that we have,
Right.
66 chapters
Yeah.
of Isaiah. It's been doubted by skeptics for years that Isaiah actually, the book has been divided into three parts, Deutero-Isaiah, Trito-Isaiah, in order to obscure the prophetic nature of the book. Because if Isaiah is living at the time of Hezekiah and is predicting Cyrus the Great, who is going to be taking over, this is a problem.
Yeah. Look, I want to
was not
ask you about some of the fun things that archaeologists are hoping to find. What's the dream inside the mind of archaeologists if we could uncover this? And a couple of other things I'd like to ask you about in a moment as well. With Dr. Michael Hazel, I'm John Bradshaw. This is Our Conversation, brought to you by It Is Written. We'll be right back. You know that at It Is Written, we are serious about the study of the Word of God, and we encourage you to be serious about God's Word also. Well, I want to share with you another way that you can dig deeper into the Word of God, and here it is. itiswritten.study. Go online to itiswritten.study and you can access the It Is Written Bible Study Guides. 25 in-depth Bible studies that will walk you through the Bible. It's going to be good for you, and it's the sort of thing that you will want to tell somebody else about so that they can dig deeper into the Word of God and come to know the things of the Bible intimately. As you get into the It Is Written online Bible study guides, you'll understand the prophecies of the Bible, the plan of salvation, and more. So don't forget, itiswritten.study. itiswritten.study. Welcome back to Conversations, brought to you by It Is Written. My guest is archaeologist Dr. Michael Hazel. I'm going to ask you in a moment about the dreamer inside every archaeologist that must exist, where he or she in the field is hoping that, man, if we could only. But I want to ask you this question, or have you comment on this first. There's a phenomenal story from your own personal experience where you miraculously survived death, certain death, miraculously. I'd love you to tell me that story if you would.
Well, I was a student in Europe for a year at a small school in Austria, and my father called me one day and said, I was 20 years old, said, you would like to join us maybe sometime. We're going to Florida again. We were living in Michigan, so Florida was always a nice place to go during the wintertime.
Oh, yeah.
So where all the snowbirds go, right?
Yeah.
So it was our tradition to go camping on one of the keys, Key Largo. And we would usually get together with a large group of relatives. And that year, I think 40 of my relatives were going to be down there. We would spend 2 weeks playing beach volleyball, going snorkeling, scuba diving. I was heavy into windsurfing back then, and so we'd always have, my cousins were too, so we always had several windsurfers and a Hobie cat. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. And on this particular occasion, I was in Europe that year, and so my dad says, have you thought, would you like to come over and visit us in Florida? And I said, well, I was kind of thinking about staying here. Well, we're running out of time. I'm going to call you back in 3 hours. I want you to make a decision. You're an adult now. It's your decision to make, but I'm going to check at the travel agency to see if there's any openings at all for you to come over. And I'll call you back 3 o'clock your time. I'll call you back, and you need to be making a decision by that time. So I went out. I was at lunch at the time. I went to my cousin's room after that, Bettina's room. She was a student there in the high school. And I told her about the phone call, and she says, well, have you prayed about this decision at all? I felt a little guilty, honestly, because she was a high school student. I was a theology student. I hadn't really thought about praying about it. So I was like, well, it's kind of a simple decision. She says, well, let's just kneel down and pray about it here. So her roommate, Katrina, and my cousin, Bettina, and myself, we knelt down and we prayed. Got up, and I had arranged already that day to take them into town for some shopping, and the whole time they were shopping, I was thinking about what my decision would be. And I have to tell you, John, I didn't have a clear answer. It wasn't like there was handwriting on the wall. There wasn't lightning. There wasn't a voice. There was nothing like that.
And this should have been the easiest decision you ever made. You're in Europe for a year. You're away from your family. Dad calls. 40 of your family are going to have fun in Florida.
That's right.
I mean, yes.
That's right.
But it didn't turn out that way.
But the more I can tell you how the afternoon went, the more I thought about staying, the more I thought about going home to Florida, the more uncomfortable I felt, the lack of peace. The more I felt about the more I thought about staying. As I thought about staying, I felt a sense of peace. That's the best way I can describe it.
Sure.
And finally, 15 minutes before the phone call, we were back at the school, and I had made my decision. I was going to stay. My dad calls right on time. Before I could get in words edgewise, he's like, "Michael, I'm so excited. I just got back from Ruth." That's the name of our travel agent. Got back from Ruth's. She has gotten a seat for you. It was almost the last seat on the plane, he says, but you're going to be flying from Frankfurt to London, London to New York, New York to Miami. We'll pick you up in Miami. Everything's been arranged. The flight's booked, at least temporarily. I've got a seat for you. And the other issue that I didn't mention was it had been a miserable fall.
Oh, yeah.
It was raining constantly. It was kind of this drizzle, wet cold that penetrates your bones no matter what you're wearing. And I looked outside and it was drizzling again. I mean, it was just a miserable. I could count on one hand how many times I'd seen the sun between September and November when this call was taking place. And so at that point, I said, "Well, but Dad, my resolve, in other words, was fading fast. But then I said, Dad, I've been praying about it all afternoon, and I've kind of decided I think I should stay." There's this long silence on the phone. My dad, first thing he said was, "Your mother will be very disappointed."
Oh.
I was like, "Oh, that's not good." And then he says, "But it's your decision. If you change your mind," he said, "the booking's going to hold for 72 hours.
Wow.
If you change your mind, call me back. We'll get the ticket. And by the way, your mother and I have decided we're paying for the ticket. You don't have to worry about the ticket."
Well,
so I said, "Okay." He says, "But I understand, and it's your decision. That's what we had agreed upon." And we talked about a few other things. That was it. 2 weeks went by. Didn't call back. 2 weeks went by. I'm driving now to my uncle's house, who's a pastor in southern Germany, to spend Christmas with Bettina and with the family. And while we were opening presents around the tree, my father calls from Florida. And he says, "Michael," he said, "I want you to talk to some of the relatives." And I can imagine exactly where that payphone was, because I was there many times. And I think all the relatives were lined up. And that was a very expensive call, one after the other. Finally, my dad gets on the phone, and he says, "I'm really glad you didn't come." And I'm like, "Why? Don't you miss me?" I kind of looked at the phone, and he's like, "No." He says, "I had you booked on Pan Am Flight 103 that crashed in Lockerbie, Scotland last week." And the tree just blurred in front of me. I literally just handed the phone to my uncle as that kind of began to sink in. I had been listening on the drive from the school up to Germany, all the newscasts about that crash, never making the connection at all. And realizing, 189 people on that flight died, additional people in the city and of Lockerbie, and I just couldn't wrap my mind around that. I was like, what's going on here?
You were booked on that flight.
Right.
It was almost impossible for you to not be on that flight. You're booked. We are paying. Your mother wants to see you. 40 family members. Fun in the Florida sun. In the winter. You've had a miserable fall. Who could say no? And yet you did. And that was God's leading.
I think so. I've wrestled with it. I dealt with all kinds of feelings of survivor guilt.
I wondered
for a
about
while.
that.
Yeah, you do. I mean, there was a whole group of students my age from Syracuse University that were on that flight, flying back home. And why did I survive? I mean, and I don't have the answer to that completely, but I do keep thinking back to that the three of us kneeling in that dormitory room and praying about it, and the sense of direction that I felt that afternoon as I was thinking and praying about it before that decision. So that was a monumental event in my life that caused me to rethink everything.
Oh, yeah?
And, I read a little book after that experience. That summer I read The Great Controversy for the first time, and I had a new conversion experience in my life that I hadn't had before, and it was partly due to that experience.
I've been to the Lockerbie Memorial, and knowing this story, I looked for your name, and thank God it's not there.
Yeah.
That's God intervening in your life in a profound way.
Yeah.
Profound way.
Yeah. And He does that in our lives.
Yeah, He does.
He does that.
And
we all
sometimes
have
we know
stories
about
to
it.
tell. Sometimes we know about it. Sometimes we have no idea.
I have a friend whose grandmother raced to Southampton from Norway, I believe, and she was so disappointed. She didn't quite get there in time to get on the Titanic. Yeah, true story.
Yeah.
Absolutely true story. You hear those stories from time to time.
That's right.
And they are dramatic. Well, it's got to be very difficult for you to look at your life now and not see that God has a very real purpose after something like that. I mean, God's mercies are new every morning. Every day we need to be able to say, God has a purpose for me today. But to see that God has a very special purpose for your life. So now, as an archaeologist, you don't sift in the sand merely for the fun of it, for the 2 breakfasts and the watermelon break.
No.
You are hoping to find the inscriptions that say King David. I mean, of course you are. What archaeologist would not? This has got to vary from discipline to discipline. Neo-Babylonian architecture, archaeology, or British, Viking, some other thing, North American. What are archaeologists hanging out hoping to find? I mean, I know it's not all treasure hunting, but you did mention earlier there's a little treasure hunter inside everybody. And maybe it varies from place to place. If you are digging in southern Israel, then you're not hoping to find the tomb of some Egyptian pharaoh.
Yeah.
But what are those things that you love to find, or the certain things that you say, this would blow things wide open?
I was asked that question one time by one of the leading archaeologists in Israel, Professor Amnon Ben-Tor from the Hebrew University. We were having dinner together at the American Colony Hotel, and our university president and a number of our board members were on that trip, and he asked that question. He says, what do you think would be the most incredible find of the century? Well, when Isaiah's seal was found, I thought that probably was one of the greatest. But so I'll tell you what Professor Ben-Tor said. If you had the choice between this or this, and one of these was an archive, a huge archive of texts, maybe, that like the ones that were found at Ebla or Ugarit or Mari or some of these places, or Babylon, would that be it? Or would it be, he says, a monumental inscription from the time of Solomon mentioning his name? And I hesitated because I was like, I don't know. I mean, he's the ranking Israeli archaeologist was at that time. And so I hesitated. He says, why are you hesitating? It's Solomon, of course. And I said, really? I said, why is that? And he says, because it would take decades, far beyond our lifetimes, to go through all these, the archive of thousands of texts.
Sure.
It would be Solomon. It would be the ultimate payback for all the work that has gone into something. So that was his answer.
That's an interesting answer.
I think that's a good answer because
Yeah.
Solomon, of course, David's son, ruled during the golden age of Israel's history, and we don't have a mention of him in the archaeological record yet.
Nothing yet.
Just like we didn't have David a few decades ago. So that would be amazing. But really, other than those really exciting finds that happen every few years, every decade or so, it is also the bigger pictures of reconstructing the past. Finding a Khirbet Qeiyafa that dates to the time of David, finding a Khirbet El-Rai that dates to the same time period. And as you look over a decade of archaeology, and you're able to say, I was involved in this project, in this project, in this project, in this project, and these 3 or 4 sites have now redefined really the discipline in terms of that early history of Judah. That's a lifetime's accomplishment right there. So I look back at it and I say, I've been fortunate, and I'm humbled to say this, but I've been fortunate to be in the right places at the right time when these things happen. I think maybe that was also divine providence.
Sure.
But God put us in places where we were able to make very significant discoveries. Can't wait to find what this ivory comb says on it.
Yeah.
That may be another groundbreaking thing. Who
Right.
knows?
And I know my question belies my ignorance. It would appear that the overall impetus or heft or power of archaeology isn't really built on the one piece here or the one
Correct.
piece here, but it's built on this vast collection of the mundane, which when put together creates pictures or reconstructs civilizations or redefines our understanding of certain time periods and shines a bright light on the Bible.
That's exactly right. And when you think about it, we're standing on the shoulders of these giants that have come before us, that have built up incrementally this vast database of information. And as a scientist in your short career of 30 or 40 years, you're just able to add a little tiny bit on top of that. And that gives us a little insight also into some of the deconstruction and some of the critical thinking that goes on today. It's much easier to deconstruct what others have done and to argue against something
Right.
that has been found or that a conclusion that has been made. That can be done very quickly and make headlines. But to add scientifically to the data and to provide additional information and data that may redefine or may add to that corpus of material, that takes a lifetime of work and takes a long time to do. And so, yeah, you kind of look at those things and we're fortunate. We've been fortunate to be able to work in a fairly secure country. Israel has not had there's always some issues going on in the Middle East, but overall it's been a very safe place to work, a very solid place. I have colleagues who invested their careers in Syria and other places, and they just haven't been able to work there. Of course, with the pandemic now, nobody is working pretty much, so we'll see how long that lasts.
Yeah, difficult. Hopefully not long.
Right.
Hey, we don't have much time, but I cannot let the conversation go by without asking you about the museum. Tell me about the museum. You've put a lot of work into the museum, the Lynn H. Wood Archaeological Museum on the campus of Southern Adventist University in Collegedale, Tennessee. So what's happening there, and what do we look forward to there?
Well, we have an exhibit currently, right now, that is going to be up until May. It's a special exhibit. We have, of course, a permanent exhibit that focuses on the whole history of the ancient Near East, from the earliest times all the way through to the Roman and even Islamic periods. But then we have special exhibits, and right now we have a special exhibit on the history of the Bible and the development of the Bible, which is fascinating. We have some of the rarest Bibles on exhibit. They're on loan, and they're only going to be there till the end of this semester, till May. After that, we have just voted as a board to actually focus on Lachish and bring in an exhibit from Israel focusing on our excavations at Lachish and actually having the artifacts here, like that seal of Eliakim and some of those other things that we have discovered there, and have it. And it's a great idea, because really we can talk about two major events that happened in biblical history at Lachish. One is the famous Assyrian campaign and what was happening before that. And then one, of course, is the great Nebuchadnezzar Babylonian campaign, where the temple.
She was raised in a family environment you might describe as severe or extreme, but somehow God delivered her from that. And that process is filled with blessings and lessons that all of us can learn from. She is Dr. Rachel Williams-Smith. I'm John Bradshaw, and this is Our Conversation. Dr. Rachel Williams-Smith, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
What a blessing to have you here. It's hard sort of for me to know where to begin this story. I might do so by introducing the book you wrote, Born Yesterday. I've read the book from cover to cover. It is a compelling read, and it tells a story that, if it's not unique, it's pretty close to unique. So take me back to the beginning. Where did you spring from? We're going to talk about how you found yourself in a family environment that was dysfunctional. But your story isn't a story of dysfunction, it's a story of deliverance. But let's start back in the beginning. Where'd you begin?
Well, the beginning, everything was kind of normal for an Adventist military family. And two older brothers, mother, father, dad in the military. So I first actually remember being in Spain. Things were pretty normal. But when I was about 5, my parents began to read a lot of the special writings, right? Special testimonies, other writings, books, studying with other people, beginning to attend church less and do more of these in-group meetings and a lot of the readings, and began to decide to adopt all the reforms. It started with, more of a focus on Jesus is coming soon. We need to get serious. All of those things that actually really matter.
Sure.
Because they are important. I know I used to get sick a lot. Always have stomach problems and this and that. So the first thing, we went vegan, and the sickness started going away. And we made changes that were actually good. They didn't taste good to me, but they were good, right?
Yeah, sure.
And then from there, it progressed to the dress. So I still remember I was sitting on the floor in my room playing with my little plastic animals. My mom came in and she was sharing with me that Ellen White says that we should wear our dresses 3 to 4 inches from the floor, and that Jesus is pictured with a garment in Revelations down to the foot. And she told me, your dresses, look at them. Do they come down to the foot? And I looked at them, I realized, no, they don't. And she said, do you want to be like Jesus? Well, what 5 or 6 year old is going to say no? Yeah. I mean, of course, I say, yes, I want to be like Jesus. So she said, well, we need to think about what to do with your dresses. So, actually, I ended up coming to her and telling her I wanted to be like Jesus. So she ended up putting swaths of cloth, attaching, just bringing the hems down. And I didn't like it, but I was learning to be like Jesus. Then the diet, we already did the diet, but then the education is where the next big change came. And they felt like my brothers were in a Christian elementary school, church school, but they felt like it was too worldly. And I had not started school. So they decided they would not send me to school, and they would take my brothers out of school. And that was the catalyst for great change, because back then, homeschooling was not legal in the state of Alabama at all. And so we were reported to the City Board of Education, and they came out and basically said, you've got to enroll your children in school or we're going to remove them. And so my father, being a Vietnam veteran, a military person, he said, really? Okay, we'll see about that. And in the middle of the night, he packed us up in his little Volkswagen van and whisked us off to Arkansas, to the Ozark Mountains. And that began the nomadic life, which transitioned into an isolated life on top of a hill in Tennessee.
Mm. So what I find really interesting, and you've alluded to this, but let's double back around. Your parents started with really good motives.
Yes.
And none of the things that they were introducing were harmful things.
Yeah.
It's good to be modest. It's good to eat well. And it's good to get the very best education that a family feels works for them.
Yes.
So they pursued that, and it ended up being fairly extreme. How does a conscientious person who wants to do the right thing know where to draw that line? How do you push it without pushing it too far? People who feel conscientious about homeschooling, sometimes they make a stand that ticks off the authorities, and they're within their rights to do so. We already mentioned how you were unwell, changes were made to your diet, which today, I mean, veganism it's in. How do you go about incorporating reforms without going over the edge?
I love this question. I think we're starting right where we need to, because I think at the heart of it all is what we can learn. My parents were definitely trying to do the right thing, just like any other parent. And I admire the fact that they were all out for what they were trying to do. But I think that one thing we all can learn is that whatever does not start, remain, and end centered in Jesus Christ is bound to go off. It's just going to. It's going to go off one way or another. It's going to fizzle and die out, whatever. If it's not centered in Jesus, it cannot ultimately be balanced and right. And it's not that my parents were trying not to focus on Jesus. It's not a matter of not trying to be centered in Jesus. It's just that you can't give your attention, your emphasis, your time to one thing and still have something else in your view. The only way we can ever get it right is if we keep Christ in the center of our view and do everything to please him, do everything out of a motive of trying to understand his character and be changed by his Holy Spirit into his likeness, and let love moderate everything we do. If you don't do that, you're going to go wrong. So with diet, and I know we'll get there, but with diet, it started out right, but it went extreme.
Yeah, I remember reading in your book about your mom might have been vanilla. And the vanilla she was using, she told you must have been a young kid at the time. There's an ingredient in there that's used to kill lice.
Well, that was vanilla ice cream.
Vanilla ice cream.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so that's gone.
Yeah.
Now they're right to read ingredients.
Yeah.
But I think the word many people would use would be the word fanatical. So they veered off into a sort of extreme thing. But I think we're ascertaining this can come from a place of genuine conviction.
Right. After a while, the focus was on keeping the rule.
There it is.
As opposed to worshiping the Creator.
There it is.
You can't do both. You can't. And the thing is, the more you focus on the rules, the more minute and judgmental and fine-tuned you become. And like Jesus said, these things you ought to have done, but not left the other undone, right, because there's something more important than the little minute details that you choose to make the center of your focus.
Yeah. The law is good. We ought to keep the law. But for Christians, the primary focus is the lawgiver.
That's right.
More than the law. And if we keep our focus right, then maybe that's how God guides us. So talk to me about your childhood. I've read in your book about how worship would be sometimes 3 one-hour worships in a day, prayers that would last for 20 minutes.
Yes.
But about your childhood, you found yourself on the top of a mountain in a rural, remote part of Tennessee. What was that childhood like?
I would say very isolated. By the time we moved up there, I was 9 and wearing a bonnet. We had been living in a bus before that. It was just a little small bus, and kind of staying out of the way of the authorities, live in a park, a state park, lived on someone's property, just trying to evade the whole being taken away from our parents.
Sure.
Was what they were trying to do, keep that from happening. Anyway, so when we ended up on what we called the hill, it was very isolated. There was a house there on the property, but it was, well, I like to say it was well air conditioned in the summer. Well air conditioned in the winter and well heated in the summer. It was very old. It had been empty for a long time. There was no one around for a couple of miles except for one neighbor up the hill, a mile away up the hill. And he was of the same beliefs and thinking that we were. He was the one that encouraged us to come up there. There was no friends and associates and nothing. We were homeschooled, kept at home a lot. We grew our own food, which was great. We made our own clothes. We attended to our own medical needs. I don't know how far in the story I should go, but my brother was horribly burned in a gas fire.
I want to ask you about that. Your brother suffered a pretty severe injury, a burn. You write about that in the book. And that was treated at home.
Yes. So these are things that later on began to make me realize that probably something was wrong. Because when that happened, I was, I think, 14 or 15. And we did not know what we were doing, but we also refused to take him to the hospital. And he was seriously injured to the point where he could have and probably should have died. But I thank God that was not the outcome. But we were trying to handle everything at home. I remember one time we had religious trainings. You asked me about the worships. So that's the Bible talks about morning, evening, and noon. Daniel prayed morning, evening, to noon. And then Ellen White mentions the worship hour. So we used to have 1 hour worships 3 times a day. My dad would dress up sometimes we would have to memorize large amounts of scripture, and we'd have to be able to defend all points of faith, interpret the scripture. And so my dad would dress up like a judge and come out and quiz us on our beliefs. And you had to be able to quote chapter and verse, reference it correctly, and also explain it. And if you did that, then your reward was painless decapitation. If you made any mistakes, then you were burned to the stake. So.
Have mercy.
What's funny is when when I give these talks, people ask me, "So what happened?" Anyway, it was scary. It was supposed to be fun. It was scary though. Of course, there was no media, there was no electricity, there was
No electricity.
No, there was no plumbing, so no running water. So the whole idea was, the intention was not to take us out to an extreme environment, but the thinking was that Jesus was coming very soon, and we needed to separate from the world and prepare for Jesus coming. So anything that happened in the process of doing those two things was okay, because it was preparing us for the time of trouble and keeping us unspotted from the world so that we'd be ready for Christ's return. So when the house would drop to 10 degrees above whatever the temperature was outside, and like one night my heels froze in my own home in my bed, that wasn't what they intended. It wasn't that they wanted those things to happen. But on the other hand, if they do happen, it's all preparation for the time of trouble.
Yeah, very interesting. So there you were, living isolated, no friends.
No.
Wearing a bonnet.
Yes.
As a head covering.
Every day.
How did that impress you as a child? You must have felt the need for companionship. Did you feel peculiar, or was it always normal? Did it become normal, or did it become more peculiar as you got older? How did you relate to that?
So the bonnet came along when I was 8. The long dress since the time I was 6. The bonnet 8. I think we were being isolated from people, so I knew I was different, but it kind of also felt normal. When I'd go out in public, I was kind of self-conscious or aware because I knew that I looked different. But at the same time, it was just the way our life was. I did feel alone a lot. I felt lonely. I had 2 brothers, but they tended to stick together and do things together more.
Yeah.
So I was alone a lot, and I felt that. And yes, I had a longing for friends, particularly as I got older. As it came to school, I wanted so much to go to school. I wasn't thinking in those terms, because in my mind, going to school was wrong. So you don't want something that's wrong, right? But I had a longing to be around other kids when I was learning. And there was one family that ended up moving up there and stayed for at least a couple of years. It was a mother and her 2 children. They were 5 and 6 years younger than me. But they would do their school in their own little trailer, and I couldn't join them, right? We could sometimes get together to haul water and things like that, but there was a lot of separation even then, because you don't want too much mingling, too much mixing. We would get together, but then it was like, let's go to your schooling, sit at your desk in your house. They go to their bus and study there. So I was alone doing those things.
It seems too, as I read your book, there are times that your dad had a fascinating relationship with you. Women are trouble.
Yeah.
Before you were born, there were 2 boys. He didn't want a girl.
Right.
Just didn't want a girl. Here comes Rachel. Now he has a girl that at least at one stage you didn't want. How tough was that?
Once again, when you're a child, you don't know that there's something different. But I do remember seeing a little girl running down the aisle of church, just, Daddy! And I was wondering what she felt, because I had never felt that. I didn't know what that was that would make her do that. I was curious about my dad, but I was intensely afraid of him. He had a terrible temper, and I also felt a sense of danger with him, actually, but I didn't know why. He did have issues, and he was trying to manage those issues, and he didn't know how. And so in his fear and concern that he would make mistakes, of course, I don't know this at the time. It's not till way later I learned some of these things. He pushed me away. He was very cold and austere toward me. And yes, he had a view of women. Women caused the fall. Women were trouble. And he wanted to raise me so that I would not be a temptress. So if you can think at 7 years old, you're starting to talk to a child as if she's going to be a temptress, as if she already is a temptress, and she doesn't even understand what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Actually, it started younger than that. It started when I was 5 and 6 years old, or probably younger than that.
I found it
but
interesting
I remember.
that your dad would train you how to be a woman.
Yes.
And what was that about? What did that look like?
So that started from the time I was about 10 and through the age of 14, when I first started showing the first little signs of puberty and moving into full puberty. He wanted to make sure that I understood how to sit, how to stand, how to walk, how to carry myself in such a way so that I would not cause men